Picture it, a frozen January morning, the kind where the air itself feels brittle and alive. The ground at Greenwich Palace is hard with frost, and every breath from the crowd hangs pale in the tilt yard. At the center of it all, King Henry VIII waits astride his warhorse, towering in polished steel, the embodiment of power and glory. The lances are lowered, the crowd leans forward, and history is about to splinter on impact. It's the kind of story you lean into thinking you're ready, but you probably won't survive this one without a shiver or two. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I love seeing this community light up across the map. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. January 24th, 1536. Greenwich Palace stood cloaked in winter frost, its courtyards alive with the thunder of hooves and the clashing of steel. This was no ordinary tournament. England's most powerful man, King Henry VIII, had mounted his destrier, a massive warhorse clad in shining armor, to test his strength before the eyes of his court. At 44, the king was still a commanding figure, broad-shouldered, skilled with the lance, and draped in custom-forged plates that glittered like molten silver in the pale sun. The tilt yard fell silent as Henry lowered his weapon, the crowd's anticipation hanging like breath in the frozen air. Then came disaster. Two armored giants collided with the force of a modern car crash. Henry's horse stumbled, throwing the monarch to the frozen ground with a bone-crushing thud. Weighing nearly 300 pounds before the armor, the impact alone could have killed him, but fate delivered a crueler blow. His destrier, also armored for war, toppled forward, crashing down upon the king's body. The court gasped as their sovereign lay pinned and motionless beneath the beast. For 2 eternal hours, England existed in dreadful uncertainty. Its king lay unconscious, his body battered, his nation effectively leaderless. Inside the palace, Anne Boleyn, then Henry's queen, and pregnant with what she prayed would be a son, waited in agony for word. If the king died, her unborn child would be thrust into a vortex of dynastic chaos. Ministers whispered in panicked tones, servants froze in terrified silence, and the tilt yard became a stage for history's cruel pivot. When Henry finally stirred, the relief that rippled through the crowd quickly gave way to unease. His first words were not of gratitude for survival, nor concern for the anguish of his subjects. Instead, he erupted in fury, demanding to know why the tournament had been halted. The charm and warmth that had once defined England's Renaissance prince had vanished, replaced by a darkness that would only deepen with time. Modern neuroscientists, examining records of his symptoms, believe this was the moment Henry suffered a traumatic brain injury, likely to the frontal lobe, the region governing personality, restraint, and impulse control. The change was immediate and devastating. The man who had once danced, composed music, debated theology, and ruled with an unusual measure of temperance was gone. In his place emerged a ruler whose paranoia, volatility, and violence would scar a kingdom. Evidence of this transformation is clear when viewed against his earlier reign. Before the accident, Henry's governance was comparatively restrained. A long, stable marriage to Catherine of Aragon, few executions, and a measured balance between diplomacy and display. But after that day in January, the tide of blood began to rise. Anne Boleyn herself was executed just months later. Thomas Cromwell, his trusted architect of religious reform, followed. One by one, the heads rolled. Wives, ministers, nobles, victims of a king whose mind had become a storm. Yet the damage was not only to his temperament. The fall reawakened an old wound on his leg, tearing open scar tissue from a previous jousting mishap. What seemed at first a painful nuisance would metastasize into the central horror of Henry's final years. The wound refused to heal, festering, ulcerating, poisoning his body from within. What began in the tilt yard as a momentary accident became the seed of his long and grotesque physical collapse. The people of England would come to see less of their monarch in the years that followed. The once vigorous athlete admired across Europe for his strength and vitality, began to vanish from public view. Rumors of his injuries spread, though the full truth was hidden behind carefully staged appearances and the gilded illusions of portraiture. Pain, paranoia, and rage were now his constant companions. The king who had defied the Pope and reshaped his nation's faith was now reshaped himself into a figure both tragic and monstrous. The fall at Greenwich had cracked more than bone and sinew. It had split apart the illusion of the Golden Prince, unleashing a descent into rot and ruin that would haunt England until his dying breath. What began as a glorious spectacle ended as a catastrophe, not only for the man on the tilt yard, but for every subject condemned to live beneath the shadow of his decline. The tilt yard accident of 1536 had left its mark on Henry's mind, but it was his body that began to betray him most cruelly. The reopened wound on his leg festered, refusing to heal, and quickly became the defining torment of his later years. In a world without antibiotics, where the causes of infection were poorly understood, such an injury was not simply inconvenient, it was a lingering death sentence. The ulcers swelled to the size of tennis balls, raw and inflamed, constantly weeping pus. The king's physicians, sworn to secrecy, drained them daily, sometimes twice, filling bronze basins with foul-smelling fluid that had to be carried away before the stench overwhelmed the chamber. Dr. Thomas Vicary, the royal physician, left hidden notes later discovered in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, describing Henry's wounds as of grievous nature, stinking and painful beyond measure. For the king, the pain was relentless. Imagine the worst toothache lasting not hours but years, gnawing in both legs, sensitive even to the whisper of silk sheets brushing against them. And as the infection deepened, so too did Henry's desperation. He ordered devices of his own design, weighted lead gutters strapped tightly around the sores, intended to compress the flesh and force the wounds closed. In truth, they only restricted circulation and worsened the rot. Perfume became his other weapon. The king's chambers were drenched in exotic oils imported from Arabia, heavy blends of rose and ambergris, desperate attempts to mask the odor of decay. Courtiers would carry pomanders, small balls filled with herbs, clutched to their noses when entering his presence. Ladies of the court fainted or vomited after long audiences, discreetly excusing themselves to preserve their dignity. But Henry's vanity demanded more than scents and bandages. He commissioned portraits that lied magnificently. The famous stance we still recognize today, the broad chest, powerful legs spread in command, was as much propaganda as portraiture. Behind the paint, those same legs were riddled with sores, wrapped in foul bandages that oozed and bled through layers of cloth. The infection, however, was not confined to the limbs. Modern medical analysis suggests Henry suffered chronic osteomyelitis, a deep bone infection that slowly poisoned his blood. Every day, toxins seeped into his circulation, inflaming organs, clouding his brain, eroding his strength. The symptoms described by contemporaries, fever alternating with chills, appetite swinging between nausea and ravenous hunger, violent mood changes without cause, all fit this pattern. Thus, the king became both victim and villain of his disease. His rages were not merely temper, but the chemical storms of sepsis striking his brain. One moment he could laugh at a jest, the next he might order the jester's execution. Paranoia spread like wildfire in his mind, visions of treachery in every corner, whispers of poison in every cup, suspicions of adultery in every wife. As his body weakened, his appetites grew grotesque. By 1540, he had grown so obese that armor had to be remade to accommodate a waist that ballooned from 48 inches to 54 in just 5 years. The Tower of London still houses these relics of metal, silent witnesses to his swelling bulk. His palaces, too, were altered to bear the weight of their monarch. Doorways widened, floors reinforced with heavy beams, special chairs crafted with removable arms to fit his massive frame. Daily life became a performance of concealment. Henry could no longer dress himself standing upright. 4 servants worked to clothe him as he lay in bed. Pulleys and slings were rigged to hoist him to his feet, after which he would be placed in a wheeled chair always hidden from public view. The image of majesty endured, but only at the cost of elaborate deception. Meanwhile, the ulcers worsened. In 1542, physicians noted a shift. The pus turned green, then brown. The stench thickened to what witnesses described as the odor of death itself. Gangrene was spreading. His body, riddled with infection, swelled monstrously. His face puffed with fluid. His once bright eyes sunk and yellowed. Where poets had once compared them to summer skies, now they gleamed only with fever and madness. The decline of Henry's body mirrored the corruption of his reign. Courtiers learned to read the colors of his moods, signaling one another with discreet ribbons, red for rage, black for despair, white for rare moments of calm. Each day was a gamble with a sovereign whose very blood had turned against him, who smelled of rot and ruled by fear. The man who once embodied Europe's golden renaissance had become a grotesque spectacle of pain, vanity, and decay. And yet, even as he rotted from within, Henry clung to the symbols of power: portraits, rituals, decrees, refusing to admit that the King of England was being undone not by assassins or armies, but by the corruption of his own flesh. The rot in his legs was only the beginning. What followed was a descent into visions, delusions, and terrors that blurred the line between madness and haunting, as the king's mind crumbled alongside his body. By the mid-1540s, Henry's body was collapsing under the weight of disease and infection, but the decay of his mind was even more terrifying. Those closest to him began whispering of visions, voices, and rages that went beyond bad temper into something far darker. The king who once charmed Europe with wit and song was now a haunted figure, speaking to ghosts and trembling at shadows. Courtiers described conversations carried on with no one present. Henry would pause in the middle of council business, his gaze fixed on empty air, and whisper responses as if debating with invisible figures. Sometimes it was his father, Henry VII, to whom he defensively justified his lavish spending. At other times it was his long-dead mother, Elizabeth of York, whose absence had shaped his childhood. More chilling were the moments when he confronted the specters of those he had condemned to death. Anne Boleyn's name surfaced again and again. At one state banquet, the French ambassador recorded how Henry suddenly rose, requiring the strength of several servants to lift him from his chair, and pointed to an empty seat. "You dare show your face at my table, witch?" he bellowed, shouting at nothing while the court froze in horrified silence. "I took your head once, I'll take it again." Moments later, he slumped back into his chair, resuming his meal as if nothing had happened. His paranoia reached levels that terrified even his loyal attendants. He became convinced that poison lurked in his bandages, demanding that the pus-soaked wrappings from his ulcers be brought to him for inspection. He would sniff them carefully before allowing them to be burned, as if betrayal might announce itself in the stench. Medicines were tested by servants forced to rub ointments onto their own skin before they dared touch the king. Nothing was safe from his suspicion. A servant sneezed during an audience, dragged away for interrogation on suspicion of using poison powder. A lady-in-waiting accidentally stepped on the royal robe, banished, her family's land seized. Even allies who had served him for decades were not spared. The Duke of Norfolk, long one of England's most powerful nobles, narrowly escaped execution only because the king's own death intervened before the warrant could be carried out. By 1544, Henry's madness had become undeniable. His face, bloated with fluid retention, was barely recognizable. The stench of his body filled every chamber despite heavy incense and strewn herbs. Courtiers clutched perfumed pomanders to their noses as they approached him pretending reverence while battling nausea. Some fainted outright, others excused themselves to vomit once free of his presence. Yet Henry insisted on appearances of majesty. His final great portrait, the Whitehall image that defined his posthumous reputation, was meant to preserve the illusion of strength. When X-rayed centuries later, restorers discovered a disturbing truth. Beneath the paint, his left hand originally clutched not a cane, but a staff, topped with a human skull. Hans Holbein had painted him as he truly appeared in those last years, death-obsessed, pacing halls with his grim token, tapping the skull against the floor as he muttered in dark reverie. Only after his death was the detail painted over at his son Edward's command, hiding the horror from posterity. Inside the court, survival meant adaptation. Pages devised an elaborate color-coded system to warn of the king's mood. Red ribbons for rage, black for depression, white for rare calm. Entire households lived in fear of a monarch whose moods could shift in seconds, driven not by reason, but by the poison coursing through his body. And all the while, Henry sank deeper into hallucination. He called for his mother, dead for decades, begging her to shield him from demons. He swore, crawled beneath his bed. He apologized to his brother Arthur for taking his throne, and his wife. He cried out to the spirits of miscarried children, promising to be a better father if only they would return. By Christmas of 1546, the court was ruled by silence and dread. A massive figure sat propped on the throne, unable to stand unaided, reeking of decay, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He was no longer a man, but an omen. England's monarch transformed into a living ghost, presiding over his kingdom with madness in his gaze and death at his shoulder. Yet the worst still lay ahead. The final weeks of Henry's life would bring not just hallucinations, but physical collapse so horrifying that even hardened physicians recoiled. What followed was not the peaceful passing of a king, but a spectacle of rot, gangrene, and terror that his government buried in secrecy for centuries. January 1547. The royal apartments at Whitehall were transformed into a fortress of silence, guarded by attendants sworn to secrecy. Within those chambers lay Henry VIII, swollen to monstrous proportions, his body collapsing under the weight of disease, infection, and years of unchecked indulgence. The ulcers on his legs had widened into craters, leaking pus and blood that no cloth could contain. Physicians changed the bandages constantly, their hands shaking, their nostrils stuffed with herbs to endure the stench. His body was failing on every front. The bone-deep infection had poisoned his blood, triggering fevers that left him delirious, raving 1 hour and comatose the next. His heart strained against the sheer bulk of his swollen frame. Breathing came in ragged gasps, each one rattling as if dragging death a little closer. His skin turned a waxen yellow, mottled with the dark patches of gangrene spreading from his ulcers. The once mighty king had become a prisoner of his own flesh. He could no longer rise from his bed without mechanical pulleys and the strength of 6 men. To move him even slightly required sheets soaked with oil, so his immense body would slide without tearing the infected skin. The odor of rot filled the palace. One ambassador later wrote that the stench was like carrion in the summer sun, unbearable to all but the most hardened attendants. Yet the greatest horror was not the smell nor the sight of his ruined body. It was his mind. Hallucinations came in waves. He begged Anne Boleyn to forgive him, calling her name through fevered sobs. He shouted at invisible demons, demanding they leave his chamber. At one point, he called out to his long-dead friend, Sir Thomas More, the man he had sent to the scaffold for treason, pleading for his prayers. Court protocol dictated that no one speak of the king's impending death. In Tudor law, to admit a monarch's mortality was treason, punishable by execution. And so, when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was finally summoned to his side in late January, he dared not ask Henry directly if he trusted in Christ. Instead, Cranmer clasped the king's swollen hand and whispered, "If you cannot speak, squeeze my hand to show your faith." Slowly, weakly, Henry's fingers closed around his. That faint squeeze was the last conscious act of England's most infamous king. In the early hours of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII drew his final breath. But even in death, his torment was not complete. His massive body, swollen with gases of decay, was so heavy that it took hours to move. When at last his coffin was sealed and placed on the journey toward Windsor, disaster struck. At Sion Abbey, where the coffin rested overnight, the weight proved too much. The wood cracked open, and witnesses swore that blood and putrefaction seeped onto the floor of the chapel. Dogs entered during the night and were found lapping at the king's remains. For his enemies, it seemed a judgment from God himself. 2 weeks later, Henry was buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, in the vault he had built to contain the remains of his true queen, Jane Seymour. Plans for a magnificent monument, golden effigies, soaring spires, a shrine to rival the tombs of saints, were never completed. Instead, the body of Henry VIII lay in a simple grave, unmarked, beside the wife who had given him the one thing he craved most, a son. No kingly statue guarded his rest. No marble glorified his name. The monarch who had ruled by terror was swallowed by silence. And so ended the life of Henry Tudor, the king who once danced and sang at the courts of Europe, who had 6 wives, countless mistresses, and a will of iron. In his youth, he had embodied the Renaissance dream of beauty, strength, and learning. In his death, he embodied only rot, flesh, power, and paranoia collapsing into horror. Henry VIII remains one of history's most infamous figures, a man who reshaped religion, defied the Pope, and bent his nation to his will. Yet his final days strip away the grandeur of crown and court. Beneath the jewels, the titles, and the portraits, there was only a dying man, consumed by disease and terror, haunted by the blood he had spilled. His death was not a majestic passing, but a grotesque unraveling, a warning carved into the flesh of a king, that power cannot outlive mortality and tyranny cannot escape decay. In the silence of Windsor, where his bones rest unnoticed, Henry's legacy whispers still, not of glory, but of warning. The king who once commanded England with the sweep of his hand ended as all men do, alone, broken, and buried by the very fears he once unleashed upon others. And if this tale of darkness and decay gripped you, be sure to explore my other videos, where more forgotten kings, lost empires, and haunting histories await.